Welcome to Angus Gaming, and guess who I am? Now today we won't have a look at optimized settings for any game. No, today we'll dive into the world of frame generation. How does it look? How does it perform? We all see those fancy Nvidia movies of many more frames, but is it really that good? And what about latency, something you don't hear Nvidia brag about? But also, I have an older TV, the Sony KD65XE9305, a 65-inch TV with a 4K display and HDR. Image quality is great, but it's an older model from 2017, so it doesn't have any fancy VRR features like FreeSync or G-Sync. Which means I want to play with vertical sync turned on, otherwise my images are torn apart. And unfortunately the Christmas man, aka Santa Claus, didn't bring me a new TV. So I'm very curious how frame generation holds up when vertical sync is turned on. Now in this video we'll mainly have a look at Cyberpunk, but we'll check out Portal RTX, Jedi Survivor and Immortals of Aveum as well. So a lot of games, a lot of settings to have a look at. Let's not waste any time and dive right into it. Before we start, the latency I had a look at for this entire video is the average PC latency, and you can turn this on in the Nvidia overlay. If you press Alt-Z you get the overlay menu, then at the top right you can select performance, and there at the top you'll already have some system metrics. Now if you press the cog or gear icon, you can configure the HUD layout. You can select where you want it to be on screen, and I want it at the bottom right. And then you can select what you want to see. Latency shows FPS and latency. Basic shows a bit more info if you like that, but I stuck with the latency option. The render latency when starting a game switches to show the average PC latency. And by the way, this overlay or HUD can be turned off or on quickly with the Alt-R combination. It's a pirate thing, I guess. Alt-R. But when I selected this, the overlay was visible for me, but wasn't recorded. So I had to do some trickery to show it to you. If you press Alt-L, these metrics will be logged in a file. So that is what I did for all my videos. Then, in the editing process, I opened these files and had a look at the lowest and the highest average PC latency I found in the file and put that in the video. It's a bit of a hassle, but well, at least you know how I got the info. But yeah, the average PC latency, what does that really mean? Well, I looked that up at the Nvidia site and they had a nice diagram of it. So what I make of it is that the average PC latency is the latency measured from the moment your PC receives a signal in the USB port to the moment it sends the data to the display. My TV in my case. So when I mention in my video that I find specific latency okay, I mean this average PC latency, and that could mean it's not okay for you. Just because maybe your display takes more time to put the image on screen, but also maybe you're used to way lower latencies and find something I find playable not playable at all. Well, keep that in mind in this video. But well, that's a lot of talking and no showing, so let's quickly start with Cyberpunk. And since the latest update we can go on this nice metro ride to have a look at the city. Hello madam, do you mind if I sit here? Well, she looked a bit knocked out actually. So, sitting down next to the knocked out lady, we'll have a look outside and have a nice view of Night City. Currently running in the RT overdrive with DLSS set to performance level at 4K. FPS is between 35 and 40, which is a bit low, so looking forward to generate some frames. Latency is switching between 49 and 74 milliseconds. Now I found latency below 100 milliseconds pretty playable, I must say. Above 100 it started to really be unplayable and laggy. Keep in mind, this is a single player game and not a twitchy reflex game as well. You do usually shoot a bit in Cyberpunk, but it's never that you need to react absolutely fast. Certainly not if you have a smart gun with auto lock on. It's no multiplayer shooter or a twitchy platformer, so below 100 milliseconds is okay. Now, staying at the same metro route, but with frame generation turned on. What we see on screen is not exactly the same as we saw a moment ago, but we're looking at the same part of the city, so I think it's pretty safe to compare FPS. So I think we're between 46 and 57 FPS, so that's quite an improvement, somewhere between 14 and 20% I think. Latency however, that's between 74 and 113 milliseconds, and that is a bit too high to be really playable I think. Also, although we have this nice win in FPS, it's still a little bit too low if we want to be playing at 60 FPS. So, most obvious thing to do here is turn down the resolution. Well, or turn down path tracing, but I think it really looks good, so turning down the resolution. And then at 3200 by 1800 we get a better result. And we're mostly in the 70s FPS wise, 70 to 80 I would say. Latency is very okay as well. 54 to 75 milliseconds. Of course, when your FPS is lower, your latency is higher as well. Certainly when you enable framegen, because it adds latency. But this is very playable. I think if you have G-Sync or FreeSync, this would be a very usable scenario. But also, the image in this video looks fine, no tearing at all, but I definitely had quite a bit of tearing on screen. The fact no tearing is showing up in this video is probably due to how the recording of this video works. It probably records the image that is sent to the TV. The TV itself, I think, is what's causing the tearing, because it shows an image but starts showing a new image halfway of showing the old one. Perhaps if I had a capture card I could record this, but I don't really know. But oh well for now, I guess. You'll just have to believe me if I say the image you just saw had a lot of tearing in it. So, what if you're like me and you don't have these VRR techniques available in your monitor or TV and need to run VSync? Well, let's turn on VSync then. In the game this won't be supported if you enable frame generation. However, in the Nvidia control panel you can enable this. So go to the Nvidia control panel. Note that I have set the low latency mode to ultra as well, but I don't know if that really works when framegen is turned on. I know it is turned on, but not to the ultra level. And then a little further down below you'll find the vertical sync option. In the bottom, when you select the vertical sync option by the way, you see that the different ways of VSync are explained. Fast sync would actually be the most interesting to use, I think, because it renders frames like VSync is off, but it doesn't tear as it doesn't use the frames that are calculated above your refresh rate. But more on that and why I don't use it now later on in the video. Let's just turn on VSync for now. And now we're at a nice 60 FPS, but sometimes frame rate drops lower than 60, which I actually find a little bit strange, because it was calculating way above 60 at all times before we turn on VSync. But oh well, let's ignore that. But what I can't ignore is that latency, 75 to 112 milliseconds, and I am afraid that is still a bit too high. You can probably play bits of the game alright, but at some point you'll get too high of a latency and the game will really become too sluggish and not playable in an enjoyable way. So the conclusion, for Cyberpunk at least, frame generation is great if you have a screen that supports VRR, a variable refresh rate, or maybe if you are running game at a high frame rate, but you want a bit more, so like you're running at 110 FPS, but you would really want to run the game at 120 FPS. But well, if you have a screen that supports 120 Hz, I assume you will probably have VRR support as well. Now I didn't really see any things that looked bad when we looked at the frame generated scenes just now in the metro. But what if we put some images side by side? And I'm mainly curious about fast moving images or fast moving scenes, or things with a lot of particles like explosions. So let's get into some action. Phantom Liberty Start might be a good test. The crash of Space Force 1. Now in full motion I think these look about as good. I wouldn't notice anything weird if you just showed me the frame generated version, I think. If you look really closely you see some artifacts when the frame gen is turned on. But it's minimal and it happens so quickly that you wouldn't really notice it, I think. Most effects still look very great. I was expecting that some of those flares or sparks from the explosion or the spaceship hitting the cranes would look muddy or artifacted or something, but they didn't, they looked fine. So now then, let's blow up something ourselves. But well, an explosion like this happens so fast, you can't really see any differences. Now if we put it in slow motion, and then you can see a little bit of difference. For one, the sparks coming off the explosion in the frame generation flicker a bit. Almost as if you see the normal frame like normal, but a generated frame has muted colors and brightness. And the explosion itself is maybe a little bit less detailed, but I think these are minimal differences. And as we looked in full speed, you will never notice this. After the explosion, I took my gun and started shooting like a maniac. but I don't really notice any differences between framegen on or framegen off. So well, I would say you can freely use framegen if your monitor supports VRR, or if you're fine with the screen tearing all over the place. But is anyone fine with that? Otherwise, so V-Synced I mean, I'm afraid framegen is a bit unusable because of the latency framegen brings with it. Now just quickly before we start looking at other games, if you liked the video so far, please give it a thumbs up. Thanks, and let's quickly move on to Portal RTX. And it's quite a heavy game to run, so running this with framegen would come in handy. And Portal runs at an FPS of 30 to 40 I would say. Latency however is quite low, 43 to 57 milliseconds. But of course, V-Sync is off, turning on V-Sync will always increase latency. But well, we want a glorious 60 FPS, so let's turn on framegen. And turning on framegen in this game gives us quite a boost. Now we're just shy of 60 FPS, so an increase of about 40%. Well, that room with the glass and the turrets firing is quite a heavy room. To run, of course. I have no clue how heavy the room itself might actually be. How heavy is a room? How heavy is a house? Well, interesting stuff. Should ask ChatGPT sometime. But yes, a heavy room to run, but in some other places you will probably be fine. Latency again however, 74 to 99 milliseconds. That's quite high, but it's just on the playable numbers. But also, the game is running at the ultra settings in 4K. Now I have made a video about optimizing Portal RTX, so perhaps have a look at that video to see if you can get a few more extra frames out of your system. Because also, if the game runs a little bit better, the latency will probably be lower just as well. Might be enough to really enjoy the game. I must say, again, the game still looks great, no weird things happening because of frame generation, no effects that look like garbage. So, still looking good. Now, for those like me with a screen without VRR, I turned on V-Sync again, and just in the menu I had a latency of 132 to 144 milliseconds. That's not playable at all. But remember I told you about that fast V-Sync? Let's turn that on. So again, this drops frames that are generated but fall out of the refresh rate of your screen, which should give you the result like V-Sync is off, but without tearing. Now, why I can't use that or didn't use that in Cyberpunk? Fast V-Sync is not available or not supported anymore in DirectX 12. Portal RTX however runs Vulkan instead of DirectX 12, so we can give it a go. And well, playing Portal with the fast V-Sync option works great. Frame rate and latency are about the same as they were without V-Sync, which is nice. Latency at max can still be a bit high, but well, consider turning down Portal a little and this might be perfectly playable with framegen on. For some reason FPS in MSI Afterburner is shown at a higher rate than 60, but well, I didn't see any tearing, so I think it's working alright now. Well, for science, as GLaDOS would have liked us to do, let's have a look at another game, Jedi Survivor. Running the game with my optimized settings, that was the second video of Hengis Gaming, and running with DLSS in Performer now. They patched DLSS in after I was done playing with the game, but well, still thanks I guess. And at this point the game runs between 55 to 60 FPS. I still have V-Sync turned on in the game, forgot to turn it off, and V-Sync always generates a little bit of latency, so we're at 60 to 76 milliseconds now. But well, apart from it being a shame that the game doesn't run that well, it's very playable. Turning frame generation on, the game runs between 80 and 100 FPS in this scene. That is great! Without adding too much latency, 60 to 77 milliseconds. So that's about the same as running the game V-Synced. Not bad, and an increase of roughly 35% in FPS. But then, turning on V-Sync, this broke the game a little bit I think. At least in how it runs. For some reason my overlay is recorded as well all of a sudden, but it jitters and stutters even though it's around 60 FPS. But it's going below 60 as well. A bit of the same behavior we saw at Cyberpunk, right? There, without V-Sync we also got a higher FPS. So I don't really get why. When you turn on V-Sync, framegen cannot keep that flat 60 FPS anymore. But look at the movement, it's so bad. Frame time is all over the place as well, so frames are not getting the same amount of screen time. It's not really good this way. Because it was so bad, I didn't look at the latency. I don't care about the latency if the game runs like this. And on screen it shows that the average latency is below 10 milliseconds. That's just not true. If it was 60 to 77 before, then it's not 20 milliseconds now. One other look at Jedi Survivor and why I think you don't want frame generation turned on. Let's have a look in this room and give it a spin. With frame gen on, Kyle's head is flickering, and that's not good. You don't want a Jedi with a flickering head. Leave frame generation off in Jedi Survivor, for the sake of all Jedis and their heads. Last game then, Immortals of Aveum, the demo, an Unreal Engine 5 title. It has lots of particles in the beginning of the game and I was curious what frame generation would make of this. So let's again start off without frame gen and see how the game runs and looks. Everything is set to Ultra in 4K with DLSS set to Performance mode, and this looks great. Lots of colorful particles, roughly between 50 and 60 FPS, latency of a 37 to 52 milliseconds, so not bad. So yes, we let these bad guys know who will be an immortal. And this is not a spoiler, this is just someone taking a guess. You might die at the end of Immortals of Aveum, or live but not become an immortal, or maybe turn into a fish. Who knows what happens at the end? Since I'll never know, let's see what happens when we turn on frame gen. A latency of about 57 to 75, so not bad, and the frame rate is around the 80s. Sometimes maybe a bit higher, sometimes a bit lower, but that's an improvement of about 30%. That's a lot. And I must say, I was really expecting those particles to become one hell of a blurry mess, but that's not at all the case. I think it still holds up very nicely. Maybe the blasts are a very little bit more blurry. Just a little, I think. But for that 30% increase in FPS, definitely not bad. Unfortunately, however, for those who need VSync, the latency goes up to 118 to 131 milliseconds when VSync is turned on, and that's really unplayable. The game becomes so sluggish. Now, there's a kind of trick I read about online in various Reddit threads and such. What you could do to improve latency apparently is set your maximum frame rate in the Nvidia control panel to just below the refresh rate of your screens, about 2 or 3 frames. So when I tried this, I got a nice 71 to 84 milliseconds latency and the game ran at 57 to 58 FPS. Now, because this is 58 FPS and not 60, I thought you should notice this, right? Some frame stays on longer than others. Well, during gameplay I didn't really notice it, so I had a little test to see if I noticed it when I put images side by side. But even side by side I didn't see any differences. And even when putting things in slow motion, I still don't see the 58 FPS screen stutter or something. In slow motion I found the 60 FPS screen stutter even more. But well, this could be a very nice way to play with frame gen enabled, I think. Now, I was curious to see if this solution worked for Cyberpunk as well, for example, but in Cyberpunk I did notice a stutter. When I move forward in this footage you don't really see it that well, but I definitely felt it. So here I put screens side by side again and slowed it down again to see the stutter. And every time you see my text stutter on screen, you can notice that the screen seems to hang for just a few milliseconds or something. But this is noticeable when playing, and I found it very annoying. So for Immortals of Aveum this seems like a nice fix, but I don't think it's a solution for every game. By the way, in Cyberpunk I also didn't see that much of a reduction in latency. But well, if you want to try this out or play with it a bit, go to your Nvidia control panel and set the max frame rate to 58 FPS, or 2 to 3 FPS lower than the max refresh rate of your screen. Well, and then there's one more thing I wanted to show you. Consider playing at 50 FPS if your screen supports it. So you mainly hear about 30 or 60 FPS. Now, I am from Europe and back in the day all content was played at 50 Hz. So the first PlayStation, 50 Hz. Now I think because of this past, current TVs in Europe still support 50 Hz. And you can select the Hz in your control panel. I think this is great if your games are running between 50 and 60 FPS. Consider playing at 50. Put your refresh rate to 50 and then just turn on VSync. Now maybe turn on VSync in the Nvidia control panel. As for Cyberpunk for example, you can enable VSync, but you can only select 60 or 30 as options in game. This way gameplay will still look very fluent. And it's not as fluent as 60, but it's definitely more fluent than 30 FPS. And also the latency wise, 50 is way better than 30 FPS. As for frame generation, I think it's a great technique and looks very good. I think it has improved quite a bit over time, because some early footage I saw, it often had troubles with particles and small details, and well, I think these look great now. I also think this technique is great if your TV supports VRR like G-Sync or FreeSync. If you're like me, however, and have a bit of an older TV, you will probably not be using frame generation as much. But you can always give it a try with VSync turned on and then setting a lower FPS limit just below the max hertz your TV supports. Or see if you can use fast VSync. And well, that is it for my look at frame generation. Thank you for watching and please consider subscribing. Most of the time I make videos about optimized settings in games, so I have a look at the settings, see what they do performance wise and graphics wise, and see if we can get the game running a little bit better by tuning these settings. And so in 2 weeks I'll have a look at Gotham Knights, see if we can get some optimized settings for that one. And thanks to Palopware for suggesting the game. So if you're curious, I hope to see you again in 2 weeks. But also of course, have a great new year! I hope your 2024 is slightly better than this year. That way 2025 can be slightly better than 2024. And if you repeat that every year, the year being slightly better than the year before, you'll have a wonderful life in the end. Now, what if I wished you the best for 2024? Then what about 2025? You've had the best in 2024. Now, slightly better, you can repeat that every year. And of course, thanks for sticking around with me, with my channel, and I'll hope you'll be joining me again next year. Well, see you in the future. Houdoe en gelukkig nieuwjaar.